everyone. My name is Francesca and I'm the owner of Luna Press Publishing. And tonight we are welcoming you all to the launch of our Luna Novella series. So I'm here together with my amazing authors.
My name is Joanna Corrance and I'm the author of John's Eyes.
My name is John Dodd and I'm the author of Just Add Water.
My name is Andrew Wallace and I'm the author of Dread and the Broken Witch.
My name is Dilman, Dila, and I'm the author of The Future God of Love.
My name is Terry Grimwood and I'm the author of Skin for Skin.
I'm M.E. Rodman and I'm the author of Clockwork, Sister.
Thank you all. So tonight we are going to be together virtually for our book launch. We were supposed to be celebrating in Glasgow at Satellite 7, but unfortunately, because of the situation, we're going to have to do it like this, and that's perfectly fine. It gives us a chance to be all together and to be with you all. So I just wanted to introduce you, first of all, to our beautiful novellas. So Luna Novella, there you go. Ta-da! So Luna Novella is a pocket-size series, and it is a series that encompasses all the things that Luna Press publishes in terms of genres. So we're looking at fantasy, science fiction, we're looking at speculative, we're looking at horror, and we started in 2020 with our very first open submission for novellas. And so these were the 6 favorite novellas, which have made obviously me a very happy person, because I have met 6 new beautiful authors to join the Luna family. So tonight we're gonna have a chance to get to know them a little bit more and to find out about their stories and get a little reading from each one of them. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Joanna, and Joanna will tell us a little bit about her story.
So I wrote John's Eyes. It started as I suppose, a seed of an idea when I was having a conversation with my dad a long, long time ago. And my dad's a photographer, and we were talking about the differences between the human eye and cameras, and how what you see it wouldn't necessarily look like a beautiful image if a photograph was taken. And that got me thinking about the differences between the human eye and cameras. And eventually I came up with the idea for John's Eyes, which is a story about a blind man who lives in Edinburgh in the not so distant future. And he's given artificial eyes. And the story, it was actually a really challenging one to write, because it's not written through John's eyes, it's written from the perspective of the eyes themselves. And the eyes don't understand human emotion. They can't kind of make assumptions about people. So what they end up doing is meticulously analysing everything that they see. And the eyes were also built with the ability to manipulate John's images as well. So as a result of that, it leads to some pretty disastrous consequences. I've got a passage from John's Eyes that I would like to read to you all. So I will do that just now. John was devastated when they removed his eyes. It puzzled me at first because they were broken and deemed unfixable. They needed to be thrown away, just as I would happily be if I failed to serve my purpose. Yet John wept for his faulty organic matter. When they synced us up at the clinic and I began to understand John better, I realised that he wept because it had meant there was no hope of him achieving natural sight ever again. When he thought of his first eyes, his heart beat a little faster, and I could sense his sadness. It felt like falling heavily without ever landing. His first eyes had been the colour of milky coffee, and people had always said that they were friendly eyes. I, however, was pale blue in appearance. John joked with the nurses that he looked like a vampire. Although he parroted their chuckling, I could tell that he wasn't really laughing. I felt the falling sensation as he mourned those useless brown orbs. We spent our first few days together in the rehabilitation centre, where John's clumsy movements were closely monitored. I set about measuring and resizing images so that eventually John could assess distance. I also altered the filters so that the world appeared in colours that pleased him. Soon, John was walking without stumbling, and his heart thumped steadily in his chest, which had inflated with joy. I was rewarded with ticks on a clipboard as the nurses nodded in approval. I swelled with pride. When the doctors asked John if he was happy with me, he replied with, "I love them." Love.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanna. So Joanna has just read from John's eyes. And so you will find this is our first in the series. So it has number 1. And the release date is the 19th of February. Okay. So we're going from science fiction to more science fiction because the next release, it's Just Add Water by John Dodd. So John, I'll leave it to you.
Absolutely. Just Add Water came from I've always been fascinated about travel to the stars and how we would ever get there and everything else. And the idea was that we'd never get there as we are. You'd have to find another way to get us there. And so you'd have a ship that would take us there, but it would have, well, freeze-dried humans on it, which then you just add water and back they come. But there's a problem somewhere along the way. And, well, the first person brought back suddenly realizes that something has gone dreadfully wrong. And I, like Joanna, have a small piece to read of this one. It's just the opening chapter on this one. I'm going to apologize in advance because the main protagonist is female and my voice can do a lot of things, but really not that. So there we go. So whose bright idea was it that the highest ranking engineer gets woken up every time there's something to fix? I sigh, feeding the power cable back through the back of the panel. This is why AL woke me up when the drones kept fixing it to regular spec and it kept on breaking. AL, artificial life. They changed it from AI because while it's alive, it's sure not intelligent. I close the cover up and see the power lines light up. The main reintegrator comes back online and there's a dull clunk as the main scoop moves another load into the deployment vats. I go to the command panel at the entrance of the room and access the main feed. Everything locked down, including the time and date. If we'd have arrived, AL would have woken up more than just me. Maybe it just woke me up so it could get the others going. That's a happier thought. Time doesn't pass by when you're a freeze-dried packet, but the process to turn you into that packet is unpleasant at the best of times, and the reintegration isn't much better. I cross over to the main canteen, designed to hold 1,000, just me and the vendors at the moment. Mine, all mine. I process a hot coffee with chocolate, caramel, and cream, looking away as the machine dumps the powder into the cup. It always reminds me of how I just got made again. The smell brings me back to the cup, bubbling as the chocolate dissolves into the mix. The scent always so much better than the actual taste, even though I haven't had taste buds for the last few light years. I look to starboard and see the top of a planet turning. It's supposed to be the commander's privilege to look at the world first, but I can't resist. I take the cup and walk over, passing it from hand to hand to stop it burning me as I walk over. It's beautiful. Huge continents of green, vast oceans of blue, the wisps of high clouds, towering peaks of mountains, emergent through them. I take a sip. Life, like the chocolate, is sweet. The nuclear detonation on the surface below breaks my reverie. The cup drops from my fingers and I press up close against the viewpoint to stare at the surface of the world below me, the transparent steel of the viewing bay cold even through the hole's insulation. A second explosion, then a third, each of them leaving a mushroom cloud rising up above the cloud cover. Other explosions flare in silence on the planet below. At the range we're at, the blasts have to be miles wide. Too far up to make out the missiles in the air, it's only when they deliver that I can see them. The world below changes from green fields and blue skies to red flames and black ashes, the cloud cover evaporating in the heat of the blast below. Relay in Section 6 malfunction. AL sounds through my comm. Please attend and repair. The words barely register. Relay in Section 6 malfunction. AL sounds again. Please attend and repair. I look down at the chocolate on the floor and then at my chrono, 2 hours since I started watching. I sigh as the speaker chimes for the third place in as many minutes. I reach up to acknowledge the signal. The speakers around the back of my head crackle, and there's a click as AL comes online. Relay in Section 6 is still malfunctioning. No trace of emotion in the voice. The world we came to is being bombed, and you're worried about a relay? I look down at the planet. When we set off to get here, this place was uninhabited. Now they're engaged in a world war? We commenced the attack at 0600 local time, Hale says. When can you have the relay back online so we can re-engage the reconstitution vats? We. A shiver runs down my spine as I turn back to face the camera. Wait a minute. We?
Thank you, John. Excellent. So after having Joanna science fiction, John science fiction, we're now slowly moving and entering into the world of fantasy. So the next novella, number 3 in the series, is Dread and the Broken Witch by Andrew Wallace. So Andrew, I'll leave it with you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Dread and the Broken Witch was my first novella, and I love novellas. I've wanted to write one for ages, and this was just a perfect opportunity. And it came about because I was writing an epic fantasy. I wanted to do a different kind of epic fantasy from the usual Northern European stuff. And the novel I was writing drove me kind of crazy. I had to put that aside. But the created world is the one where this novella takes place, and in this created world, it is the Northern European tradition, but they are engaged in an Iraq-style misadventure in another country, and it's this one, and it's from the point of view of the people who live there, and particularly the Broken Witch, who's a character I loved writing. I'd wanted to write a trans character for a while, and it is her. Her brokenness is not her transness. Her brokenness is the result of a war in the north with the heroes of the other book. So this particular one, I did the opening chapter for the Luna Press YouTube channel, so you can look at it on there. This one is a later one, it's a later piece, and it is called The Carny Paths of War. The battle was a living stain below her. It seethed and grew, changing shape and colour. The smells of burnt blood, metal, and excrement reached her, even suspended as she was in the upper reaches of the Carny Path. She had chosen her usual height of 200 feet above the fighting, always a tricky decision and dependent on the nature of the battle. This one had fewer archers on both sides after yesterday's slaughter, so the risk of an arrow through the head was diminished. Around her, the grassland plain stretched off in all directions, the flat, even ground, perfect for fighting. It was early morning. The sun was bright, but a cooling wind blew from the west. It flowed around the Broken Witch's armor, moved the tight black ball of her hair, and rustled the leaves of the woodwing. The woodwing was a complex of interwoven gnarled wood in the shape of 2 slim spindles, one in front of the other. The Broken Witch was stretched across the top of these structures and fitted snugly against them. Her midsection rested on the joint between the spindles, and her legs were hooked into the swelling at the rear to prevent her falling off. Her hands were inside the front spindle, gripping 2 woody knobs, one each side of a central trunk. Thorns behind these protrusions and under the Broken Witch's wrists sometimes grew into her flesh to replenish the blood connection, but they were quiescent now. Leaves of every shape and colour sprouted along the rear spindle, lending the woodwing a festive look. The leaves could adapt to the physiognomy of the wounded to regrow flesh and bone and dissemble infection, while sap in the wood could be consumed to address every ailment of human and Daxu. A sense of alarm. Spears coming at her. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. So we are staying within the fantasy world, and this time we're going to explore The Future God of Love by Dilman Dila.
Hello, my name is Dilman Dila, and my novella is The Future God of Love. So this novella came to me around about last year, when I was going through yet another really difficult time with regard to relationships. And around that time, the best friend of my ex asked me to gift her husband one of my books. She wanted it autographed so that she could give it to him as a Father's Day present, I think. So at that moment, it struck me that, as a writer, as an artist, as a storyteller, it is my duty to make other people happy with the works that I create, but I might never be able to experience this same kind of happiness. Just given the nature of work that we do, you work all the time, you work late into the night, and this has an effect on relationships, and it means, you can't hold on to relationships for long, and it kills your socializing skills and all that. So all these things were going through my mind when the idea for this story came about. So the story is set in a future world. I don't know if it's a future world or an alternate world, but it's a fantasy world set in somewhere in Africa. And it's about a town. It's centered on a town that needs stories to survive. Like, it plays, of course, on the human need for stories. Like, for some reason, as human beings, we need stories in our lives. Without stories, we are not human. So this town needs a new story every month for it to flourish. And so there is a resident storyteller, and his work is to provide the town with good stories every full moon. But after like many years of doing this, he's struggling. He has some kind of block. He can't produce good quality work, and yet because he works all the time, he's never had time to socialize. He's never had time to have a girlfriend or a wife, and so he finds himself in the Middle Ages and is lonely and is alone. And the paradox is that because he writes love stories and he has inspired so many relationships, he has influenced the culture around love and marriage in his world. He is considered the future god of love. So like after he dies, he joins the rank of ancestors, and then he becomes an ancestral spirit that blesses marriage and love and things like that. I'm going to read the first page, and which kind of gives you a hint of, this world. Jamaro sat on a soft cowskin mat, staring idly at a moth as it danced around a tadoba flame. Only a little oil remained in the lamp, and it emitted more soot than light, filling his heart with a faint smell of onions. The oil can sat on a bookshelf at the other end of the room, yet he could not summon energy to refill the tadoba. He saw himself as a wounded rooster, lying in the yard, waiting for a knife, her voice, to slice his neck. The voice would come from Wang-O, where elders had gathered to hear her audition for resident storyteller. The breeze rattled the half-open window, and murmurs filtered in. The elders were already excited, though her show had not yet begun. He overheard one giving her a pet name, Nyadwe, the daughter of the moon, for she was so beautiful. Another claimed that she had a captivating voice that made people float above the world like happy birds. A third elder said she was such a gifted storyteller that she did not need an actor to narrate her story, nor did she need musicians and dancers and performers. She did it all by herself, relying on her voice, that enchanting voice. Kwaro sent her to be the Laboki of Wendo Town, one elder said, raising his voice to make sure Jamaro could hear him. The others fell silent for a moment, as if waiting for Jamaro's response, and then they continued praising Nyadwe. A long time ago, after his breakout story, elders had said that Kwaro had blessed him with a rare gift, and so they made him the new Laboki, even though the resident storyteller was doing well. But they were saying this of her even before she auditioned, and he knew it was because he had failed to give them any good story for the last 30 moons. He wanted to hate her for she would take away his job, but he was thankful that the ancestors had sent someone to put him out of his misery. He would not have to suffer anymore to create a new story every full moon, for it would now be her duty. The town needed a new story regularly, for stories kept the darkness away. Stories made them to remember what life had been like yesterday and to imagine what life will be like tomorrow. Stories were spiritual food, and the town was starving. They survived on his old stories, eating and regurgitating and eating them in a desperate loop. But these could not give them new dreams. They supplemented this stale diet by borrowing stories from other towns. But to be happy, they needed stories set in Wendo, with characters unique to their town. Without any new and good stories, the town would die. If he was an ordinary Laboki, they would already have gotten rid of him. He was a future god, and this helped to keep the town alive, for it made his tale stories palatable. He became a future Quaro when he was still a boy, just as his beard had started to sprout. At that time, he was struggling through a traumatic childhood and was not even thinking about being a Laboki. He feared he would end up a drunkard like his father, or hopeless like his elder brother, who killed himself because he could not afford dowry to marry. Though at that time Jamaro still had a few seasons before he could think of marriage, he worried that no woman would want to be his wife because he could not afford bridal wealth. He began to imagine what love would be like if there were no bride price. Would people still put a price on everything? Would fathers treat their daughters like cattle? And would wedding ceremonies still be some kind of slave markets? He then created a story, Children of the Wound, in which he painted his vision of marriage. He first performed it in a market, hoping for nothing more than a few cowrie shells to buy himself lunch. But his performance captivated the entire market, and the Ruot invited him to audition. Once he told the story properly, with music and dance and animated images, people began to dream of the world he had imagined. Within a few months, bride price was outlawed and weddings ceased to be markets. If any dowry was involved, it was a gift that the groom's family gave as they pleased and as they could afford. The universal success of the story secured him a high status as a Quaro of love. Upon his death, they would build shrines in his honor. People would worship him and ask him to bless their love affairs and their marriages. His name was already important in marriage rituals, and his soul had become a central part of courtship dances and weddings. And yet, he never found anyone to love him. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dilman. Excellent. So that was The Future God of Love by Dilman Dila. We are staying again with fantasy. We are now with Skin for Skin by Terry Grimwood. So Terry, tell us about your novella.
Hello there. Yes. Well, I've always had, I come from quite a religious background, and I've always had a sort of fascination with the idea of God and the relationship between God and humans and God and man, and also the fact that in some ways we are being manipulated, or pawns in a game, if you like, played out by God and the devil and all the rest. And one of the most interesting, I think, chapters in the Bible, or books in the Bible, is the book of Job, in which there is actually, it opens with what seems like a wager between God and the devil over the soul of this poor unfortunate fellow called Job, who's a rich man who in one day loses absolutely everything and ends up covered with boils, sitting in a pile of ash. And it's all, it seems to me, just because of a kind of a wager between the two beings. So that was kind of behind this book, but there's more. It's probably a lot about my own complex relationship with religion, because I'm not anti-religious at all, but it's very complex. So the story really is about what I called a troubled and troublesome Anglican priest who finds herself in a very remote parish. She's like exiled virtually to this parish, and but there's something very wrong with this place. She begins to wonder if it even exists. And her congregation, although they seem very ordinary, she's beginning to see that they're probably not quite what they seem. So the extract I wanted to Actually, the title is a quote from Job, Skin for Skin. That's from the opening passage of Job. So what I wanted to do is read a bit where she's just arrived at the parish. So she's met on a lonely railway station, met the deacon, who's a lady named Angela, and who has driven her now through the countryside. And she first encounters the church, which is St. Jude's, which is actually the patron saint of lost causes, by the way. Right, so St. Jude's was a lonely ancient building with a simple circular Norman tower. It was set back about 100 yards from the road and apart from the adjacent, equally ancient rectory. There were no other houses in sight, not even a barn or electricity pylon, and very few trees, apart from an isolated copse on the far side of the field at front of the cottage. The land sloped gently away in all directions, nothing but expanses of ploughed earth, divided up by lines of scrappy hedgerow. It was brown, desolate, and unutterably lonely. Eve climbed from the car and was immediately punched by a cold wind that swept in from the east. Heavy grey cloud boiled overhead. A few drops of icy rain stung her face. Then she felt Angela's hand on her shoulder, and it was, again, comfort from a simple gesture. "It isn't as bad as it looks," Angela said, as she led the way to the rectory door. "I was here when the delivery van arrived. Everything is in its place. I lit a fire earlier, and there's a casserole in the slow cooker." "Well, I don't own a slow cooker," Eve said. "Well, you do now." "I had two, now I have one. Think of it as a welcoming gift. The casserole should be done now." "Thank you. I don't know what to say. It's very kind of you." Eve felt brighter when she noticed the smoke curling out of the cottage's chimney. She could smell it too, woody, oddly familiar and welcoming. "I'd like to see the church before I go in," Eve said. "It's the reason I'm here after all." Angela looked a little surprised, but then she smiled. "Of course, I understand. I've got the key with me here." The door opened without so much as a creak. It took a quick search for Eve to locate the bank of light switches to the left of the doorway. The church seemed even smaller on the inside than it looked from the outside. The walls were plain white, the roof was low and supported by dark-stained wooden beams. The seating consisted of rows of ancient, uncomfortable-looking pews. Many churches have replaced such seating with modern chairs. She would look into that. No point in a congregation being physically uncomfortable. A hymn board hung from the wall, displaying the numbers of the last hymns sung before her arrival. The hymnals themselves were piled neatly at the end of each pew and looked old and battered. No modern gospel music here. St. Jude's was a place of traditional hymns, accompanied, presumably, by the modest-sized pipe organ situated to the left of the nave. She warmed to the place. There was a reverence in the old language of the hymnals. There was also a simplicity and honesty about the minimalist lines of the church itself. St. Jude's was not built to intimidate. There was little show or pomp. The pulpit was old but functional, and she glimpsed an enormous Bible open on its lectern. Without looking, she knew it would be a King James and not a modern translation. She moved towards the altar, which was dressed in a spotless white cloth and bore a gleaming gold cross flanked by two equally impressive communion chalices. And there was the window, where tradition stopped. If this was a biblical scene recreated in the coloured glass, then it was one Eve had missed during her dozen or so read-throughs of the Bibles over the years. A story from the Apocrypha, perhaps. Now, she'd read that too, and nothing sprang to mind. Central to the image was a woman, in profile, leaning over a well. The woman wore the kind of robes that were standard in biblical representations, and they were coloured green and edged with gold. The woman's head was covered, her face barely visible. The well was little more than a hole in the ground, edged with rough grey paving. The background was of rolling desert, featureless and bland, apart from a bank of clouds gathered over the horizon. A storm was coming. Eve could feel it, a remarkable effect for stained glass. A bare and muscular arm extended from the mouth of the well. The woman grasped it with both her hands and appeared to be in the act of trying to pull its unfortunate owner out of the hole. There was something unwholesome about the darkness of that pit, a solidity, a completeness that made her shudder. There was also something disturbing about the arm that reached out from it. Nothing Eve could define, just a feeling. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Terry. Excellent. So this was Skin for Skin by Terry Grimwood. So from dark fantasy, we now move over again to fantasy. So we don't move over, we stay with fantasy. But we're going to Amy Rodman with Clockwork Sister.
Okay, so I've always been really fascinated by the idea of changelings and artificially created life and what makes a person and who decides that. Clockwork Sister is basically about Eon, who is artificially created for a purpose. And then when her purpose ceases to exist, so is she supposed to. And obviously isn't quite good to plan. She's down for this, but things go awry, and so she ends up discovering a whole kind of secret, kind of sort of hidden world of other people like her who have kind of escaped this fate of having to follow this particular rules and live for this purpose, and then stop living afterwards. And then shenanigans and murders and hijinks ensues. But yeah. And I'll read you a little bit from the opening. Clockwork Sister. The black lacquer-wood coffin of Mara Atam, 8th princess of the Tamian dynasty, rumbled slowly along the heart vein of the city towards the distant spires of the imperial tombs. Behind it, the many leaves of the Empress's bridge folded back against each other with well-oiled precision, separating the island of the imperial palace from Tam City once again. The heart vein was lined with citizens, each one standing with their heads bowed. Silence shrouded the path, broken only by the hollow thud of the funeral drum as they beat out its rhythm. Black streamers whirled in gusting winds from open windows. Swathes of black cloth covered the doors of the houses and shops that ran along the vein. The colour of mourning scattered through the capital. Mourning for a woman no one in the city had ever seen. Ian's hands clenched briefly inside the pockets of her coat. The master of ceremonies had placed her directly behind the cart, close enough to touch the coffin's slick, polished surface. She walked at the head of 500 imperial courtiers and did not look behind. The courtiers were silent too, affording the princess more respect in death than they ever had in life. Ian supposed she should have been bitter about that, but all she felt was numb. Nothing seemed real. Not the coffin, not the drum, not the ground beneath her feet, not the crowds that watched in silence. The sky above was heavy with cloud, promise of rain and a wind that was damp and cold and blew along the broad passage of the heart vein with enough force to tug at the elaborate headdresses and black mourning streamers that adorned the procession. The elaborate arches of the bone bridge reared up ahead, pale against the shadowed sky. The parapet was lined by bridge guards in black and red livery, iron-tipped spears in their hands. They stood straight, heads up, in proud salute to the cavalcade's approach. The bone bridge was the longest of the Maker's bridges, stretching out over a mile of northern ocean before it reached the islands of the dead. A scattering of wind swept the crowd, and Ian shivered despite her thick wool coat. The coffin in its creaking, straining cart rumbled across the bridge and into the imperial necropolis to the thud of the drum. The great tombs of the imperial family with their golden spires and bright red-tiled roofs stood alone on the crest of the hill, a city in miniature. A long winding path crept up the steep incline in a lazy spiral that set the cart drivers swearing and the courtiers panting as the cavalcade picked up its pace, nearing its destination. The paths and gardens that surrounded the tombs were immaculate, perfectly groomed by imperial gardeners. The clearings between tombs were scattered here and there by delicate wooden shelters, sides open to the elements, intricately carved and fragile as spun glass. Spaces for members of the imperial family and their guests to rest when they visited. The princess's tomb waited in the sunward side of the necropolis. It was smaller than that of her mother and aunt, sheltered behind the bulk of her elder sisters as befitted a princess who had never become a mother. Lamplight glowed in its windows, and its great double doors stood waiting. Beyond them, the vast stone slab where her tomb would rest gleamed in the golden glow, marble inlaid with veins of gold. Ian blinked. There was rain on her face, damp on cheeks and eyes. The cart rumbled in through the doors and out of sight, the doors closing behind it. Inside, servants would be frantically lifting the coffin, carefully setting it on its bier, and hurriedly wiping fingerprints and rain from its pristine surface. Outside, the court waited, silent in respect, the wind whistling past the leaning bodies of encircling tombs. Those closest to Ian shivered, though she could not help but notice that space that existed around her. When the door swung open again, the coffin was in its place, and the Empress herself was standing beside it. 8 imperial princesses and 1 prince flanked their mother, representatives of Mara's immediate family, clad entirely in black, their eyes heavily cold, streaks of black on cheeks and chin. The court went to its knees on the flags of the square before the tomb, heads bowed in respect and adoration. Ian knelt expressionless, conscious that the only mark of mourning she had chosen were the ribbons braided into her long dark hair. She kept her hood up and her head bowed, shrinking back from the weight of the Empress's cool dark gaze, aware that when the Empress looked at her, she saw her dead daughter's face.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thank you. So here they are, our very first 6 Luna novellas, and they will all be available starting from the 19th of February, one a day until the 24th. So you can find them discounted, a pre-order price in our store, in the Luna Press store on the website. And there is also an opportunity to get the bundle at a reduced price. Now, the reason is also because if we had been at a convention, it is customary to have amazing deals, you know, as well. So we're gonna obviously try to recreate that online for you all. I would like to ask our authors if they want to tell us briefly what are they working on at the moment, whether it be a book or a project or a movie or something like that. Joanna, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I've been working on a few things. I always tend to have a few things on the go in terms of short stories or novels. And at the moment, I am actually working on a novel. It's kind of a horror speculative fiction, and I think I'm going to call it Where the Selfish Men Go. And it's a story about it's about a man who lives in Edinburgh and is lured away to a rural hotel. I think for some reason in my writing, I always seem to be quite obsessed with hotels. I find them quite spooky settings. So he goes to this hotel and he finds himself trapped there by the snow. So he stays there for Christmas and he stays there for a longer period of time. And as he does that, he starts to notice strange things. There's never guests in the hotel. The snow never goes. And the staff who work there have a very strange relationship with one another and the hotel owner, where they tell horror stories that may or may not be true to one another in front of the fireplace at night. And the main character, Eric, starts to realise that it's not the snow that's trapping him there. So that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Excellent, thank you. John, what about you? What is keeping you busy these days?
Well, apart from conventions, I'm working on a series of novels, beginning with Red Sword at night, moving on to Red Sword in the morning, and then Red Sword in the evening, which is it's a trilogy of books. The question was, what would happen, War of the Worlds, if they landed on a world that was magically active? And suddenly you've got several of my most interesting passions, which were alien invasions and Dungeons and Dragons, role-playing, that sort of thing. And what would happen if you got the two together and went from there? So 75,000 words in, and it's going places. So
Good,
thank you.
Great. And Andrew, what about yourself? What are you working on at the moment? The mic.
Yes, hi. So a couple of things. One is quite a light, funny one, which I just launched. So I'm sort of, what I'm working on is sort of promoting that. And it's called Space Gravy. And it's Hitchhikers meets Bond in a galactic great escape. And I chose to do that one now because I think everyone's, needs that sort of sense of freedom and fun. And that absolutely is what that book is. So that's out now. And the other thing I'm working on is, I'm just coming to the finishing touches of it, is a short book that I wrote with my daughter, Lana. And we started writing that a couple of years ago just for fun. And it's evolved over time. And it's become a kind of, I sort of hold it, an epic fantasy for middle grade or 7 to 12-year-olds. And she came up with all the ideas and I wrote them down. And because it's from the mind of a child, I feel that, hopefully it will appeal to everyone, but particularly kids of the age of the one who wrote it. And I sort of created a little version of it for last Christmas so she could just have one. And then this year it's sort of been percolating. I've really polished it. So it's going to kind of be launched formally next week. And it is called Imelda and the Horned Owl.
Excellent. She must be really pleased. I bet.
Yeah, I actually had to check it because I've done a really lovely a cover of it, and I was looking at it. I thought, what's happened? And she'd got onto it and made some adjustments in pink. I'm like, okay, we'll have to talk about that. It just didn't quite work.
That's good though. And
oh yeah,
excellent. Dilman, what about yourself? You're always very busy with your movie makings as well, documentaries. So what you're working on at the moment?
At the moment, I'm working on a short film. It's going to be entirely made on CGI.
Oh, wow.
It's kind of, it's more experimental because I like experimenting and learning new things. So last 3-4 years, I've been learning CGI, and I think I'm at a stage where I can try to make a short film entirely using computer imagery. So it's giving me a bit of sleepless nights. And of course, at the same time, I'm producing a TV series for a channel in Africa here, a cable network. But yeah, it's not really as joyful as, working on projects of my own, like a film. I'm also working on another novella, which it's going to be more horror than this Future God of Love, but it's also around the same theme of love. But in this one, it's an ex of a girl who comes and he makes her pregnant without her knowing. And then she wakes up one day and she's 6 months pregnant, and is trying to figure out how it happened and what is it that's in her body. And yeah, it's kind of a horror, pregnancy horror, but I don't want it to be like she's carrying inside her baby. I mean, inside her body, it's just like an actual child. So it will probably be a play on relationships, and you're pregnant, but you really want to have a child with somebody, and you see you're stuck with somebody in a which is not going anywhere. So I'm trying to play on that and making it a pure horror. Yeah, rather than just, it's a bad relationship thing. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you for that. And Terry, what about you?
I'm reworking a novel that I sort of completed a few years ago, but it needs, I discovered it, I thought it really needs a lot of work, which is called The Alone. It's a story of a man, he comes into this world aged about 45 in 1916, and it's now 100 years later, and he's on Earth as an observer of the sort of minutiae of human life, not the big events, the minutiae, although he gets involved obviously in the First World War as a stretcher bearer, and then in the general strike and different things throughout the century. But the main thing is his relationships. I suppose it's more in the realm of things like The Time Traveler's Wife or the Strange Case of Benjamin Button, that type of speculative fiction rather than pure science fiction. Is more of the story about him and his relationships and what it is to be the same age for 100 years. Well, everyone else around you grows old and your friends die, and the reason for it, and observing what's going on around you. So that is that sort of story. Okay.
Thank you.
I'm almost finished. It's nearly finished.
Oh, that's good. Good. Okay. And Emmy, what about yourself?
So I just finished the first draft of something yesterday, actually, which is a weird feeling. Like, I've written this thing now. Not looking at it for a while, but yeah, that was odd. And yeah, it's like a full-size novel about a dude who's brought up in a society where he's part of a group of people who have to protect the rest of the world from monsters that arrive when reality shifts. So it's like a whole entire new kind of nightmare landscape sort of arrives during the night and then disappears again at some point before sunrise. And while it's there, kind of taking over everything, there's like monsters and stuff. You have to fight them. And then fun times. But obviously, and then he discovers that things aren't as he thinks in the world, and the things he's been told are not as simple, and there's war and some genocide and some other stuff. So yeah, that's fun.
Well, that's good. That's good. Well, our authors are all very busy, and we are actually looking forward to their next projects and endeavors. So please do support us. If you know, there are Twitter feeds, there are Patreon pages. You can find all the link on the Luna family page. You will find all our authors there, so you can see what they're up to and where they are, so you can follow more closely. So for now, then, all that is left for me to do is to show you once again this beautiful opening of the Luna Novella series, to thank you once again and to wish you a good night from me, Francesca, Joanna, John, Andrew, Terry, Dilman, and me. And thank you so much for joining us tonight at the Novella launch. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you too. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.